My name's Amanda Martin and I'm the president of the National Education Union, and I want to start by saying thank you very much for joining us. I realise that so many of you, it's the end of a long day already, and you'll come here to hear hopefully some really good information from Kevin and Mary, to be inspired and to feed back to us what's been going on in your schools up and down the country. Before I start, I am just going to go through the housekeeping as usual. So firstly, this call is recorded so that it can be saved and used for our own information, and also very often we put it out so that people can see it afterwards, those that aren't here. We also save the chat that you're writing in, so please make sure you look at the behaviour code and treat each other kindly in there and adhere to the NEU's rules when we're looking at online meetings. This is in webinar format, so you will only see myself, Mary and Kevin and our fantastic signer, Sam Riddle. But we absolutely want you to participate, and there are two ways to do that. One is in the chat, so if Kevin and Mary are pointing out stuff and you want to know what it is you're talking about, or a link to the website, we can absolutely put it in there. Also put some ideas, and it's really lovely to see so many hellos coming through from everybody. But if you want to ask a question, you need to go to the Q&A box and put your name and where you're from. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in already, so please wait for Mary and Kevin to talk, because they may well answer some of those questions. And I mentioned our Fab Tech team, they will be going through all of those questions, and we've got 1,700 of you registered on the call today. So obviously, if you can wait, that would be really good. I am going to point out who the tech team are today. They are Richard, Nikki, Andy, Vin, Mike, who I've mentioned already, and Henry. And our signer today is Sam Riddle. And without further ado, I'll pass you over to your joint General Secretaries, Mary and Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Hi, everyone. It's Mary. I'm starting us all off today. So I'd like to echo Amanda's welcome. It's wonderful that you're here. And we hope that this call will be useful to you, and you'll get new information. So all we have now is known unknowns. There are changes every day. One day, free school meals definitely aren't running in the summer. The next day they are, thanks to the NEU and to the wonderful Marcus Rashford. Only last week, the Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, announced that primary schools would not be opening to all pupils before the beginning of the summer holidays. In making this announcement, the government bowed to the inevitable. Everyone else, it seems, apart from ministers, understand that social cohort distancing will not be possible with all pupils allowed to return to the same number of classrooms, unless you've got double the number of teachers and double the number of classrooms. Yesterday, the government issued another statement for primary schools, which said that in some schools, there could be a capacity to welcome more children back in groups of sizes of no more than 15 before the summer holidays. And the government said that those schools with spare capacity may choose to welcome back additional pupils, prioritising them on their knowledge of the children and their communities. And so schools who the offer isn't being fully taken up by currently the reception year 1 and year 6 could offer for other children to come back from different year groups. We were expecting something from the government along these lines, and this is not the worst announcement that it could have made. But yet again, the government is saying too little, far too late, asking school leaders to make difficult judgments on very little information, with very little planning in, no lead time. And the government is giving no additional funding, no additional staff, or no additional classrooms for this wider pupil intake. Indeed, the letter to heads say, if you're going to do this, do it on your current resources. There'll be no extra funding, no extra space. So it's too little communication, it's too late, and it's not properly resourced. And these continue to be problems with the government's approach to getting children back to education in a COVID world.
So it was us and you in our union who led the campaign that schools should only open to a wider pupil intake when it was safe to do so. And many of you on this call will have taken part in that campaign, writing to your MP, signing petitions, organising the union members in your school to work with heads to oppose too early a reopening. And in that first week from June the 1st of wider primary school opening, we did a survey which showed there was a much more limited opening than the Prime Minister had wanted. He'd said all primary schools were going to open to nursery, reception, year 1 and year 6. Our survey showed that on the first day 44% of schools didn't open to any of those year groups. About 21% opened to only some of those year groups, and only 35% opened to all of them. And even in those schools, the number of children who came back was really quite low. The figures are rising as the weeks go by. They're still lower than the government wanted. Our ambition has never been to stop children going to school. It's always been that children go to school when it's safer to do so. And we know from Independent Sage, the case number dropping is happening and contact tracing is getting up and running. So it is getting safer. Let's hope the government doesn't mismanage that so the case numbers start going up again. But at the moment, it gets safer week by week. So the numbers are starting to go up. Still not as much as the government wanted, but we think it's right to be cautious and to open slowly. It's now why the government's saying take on more pupils outside the established returning year groups, because parents haven't been convinced. Mary and I want to thank all of you that worked to persuade your head to delay. It's given more time for that case rate to fall. It's given more time for that contact tracing to be working properly, more time for our society to be safer. And even in the schools that opened, and in those schools, our reps made it safer by getting the checklist in place, by getting social distancing in place, by ensuring that the most vulnerable staff were still making their contribution working from home. Whatever you did, it's been valuable in keeping us all safer. So thank you very much for whatever you did.
Thanks, Kevin. So it should have been obvious, shouldn't it, to Boris Johnson and to Gavin Williamson that COVID-19 is going to be with us for a long time. And instead of pinning their hopes, their misplaced hopes, on all pupils, primary pupils going back to school before the summer holidays, what the minister should have been planning, as the Scottish Welsh governments are planning and have been planning for many months, is that even in the autumn term, it's highly likely, entirely possible, indeed probable, that we're going to have to do education differently. And during the last few days, there's been calls from politicians of all parties, including the Conservative Party, from Labour and from the Lib Dems, from the Children's Commissioner, Anne Longfield, from the Sutton Trust, from other charities, for a plan for education. The cry has been, where is the plan for education? Where is the plan for getting children back to school? Where is the plan for disadvantaged children? Where is the plan to ensure that in September we have things running differently from now? And a big realization has dawned that things may not be going back to normal in September, that it is really very possible that schools will not be able to accommodate all pupils in school for all of the week. And that fact, and so we are clear, and we have been clear in the NEU, that the focus has to go from schools to education. And we need an education plan, an education recovery plan, a plan to do education differently so that children do not become the hidden casualties of COVID, losing even more months of their education stretching into the autumn term. And that's why last week the NEU launched its education recovery plan. It's 10 points, 10 things that the government must do to ensure that children do get educated in this new and challenging time. We want the government to recognise that children's education is as important as its jobs recovery plan. Because if children can be educated, then their future is more secure and the future of our nation is more secure. It's the most important gift you can give children and young people, apart from the necessities for life. The most important gift, the most important birthright they have is education, to invest for the future. So this is a plan that we believe, the NEU's plan, that the government should adopt. And the plan has been welcomed widely. We did a Zoom call yesterday with parliamentarians, and we were told that our plan was supported by the Labour Party, by the Lib Dems, and by the Greens. It's been supported by influential education commentators like Laura McInerney, who said this is a really serious contribution to thinking about how education should be done in the future, and particularly looking towards September. But if this plan is going to be implemented, we need government to start doing the thinking and the planning now, because we can't get to September and we can't be in the position they were in when they said that all children could go back before the end of the summer term. We can't be in the position where they're just relying on social distancing, not being in existence anymore, to get all the pupils back into already overcrowded and very full schools. So our plan does the thinking that the government should be doing about how education should be done differently.
The 10-point plan we've got is high level. It's a political intervention. We'll be expanding on the points of it over the next few weeks, but we just want to run through them at that headline level, because we do want you to feel that you can defend them, that you can promote them to MPs, to councillors, to your governing body. So our 10-point plan starts by saying that disadvantaged children, young people and their families must be a key priority. They must not become the casualties of COVID. Now, in the run-up to schools reopening, government ministers were very keen to talk about the disadvantage. Our concern is that the disadvantaged kids will drop off the radar when the schools are more open, because we worry that the actual argument was about getting parents back to work, not an illegitimate thing by itself, but we worry that disadvantaged children will drop off the radar. We want to keep them front and center. And that's whether that disadvantage is because of poverty, because of inequality, or because of racism, because of the racial group the child is in, or because of their SEND status. So our first point, disadvantaged children, young people, their families must be the key priority. Our second point grew out of that, and it's our first victory. We said at point 2 of our 10-point plan that free school meals must continue to be provided over the summer holiday, because we have been told by our members, by you, across recent years, that holiday hunger, that children being hungry during the holidays is an increasing phenomenon, with children and parents using food banks and children coming back to school after the summer holiday, reporting hunger during the summer holiday. So we're really pleased that with Marcus Rashford's support, we've won that first one, 9 more points of our 10-point plan to win. Our third point is that local authorities should be running a summer holiday local offer to children and young people. Now, this is in the context of, if the virus is coming under control, if we are able to let up slightly on the restrictions, which the government is doing, then we don't think that schools and catch-up is the right model. We think that disadvantaged kids need to be out, they need to be in play schemes, if it's possible, and we think, if it's possible because of the lockdown being eased, and we think local authorities are the sensible body to coordinate that. So we're calling for the government to fund local authorities, for local authorities to be coordinating the planning of summer holiday clubs, particularly in areas of deprivation, so that children and young people have a safe place to go, where social distancing can still be looked at, with positive activities to engage and interested in them, and building their confidence for a possible return to school in September. We think children on free school meals should have the first access to those. This doesn't say, we aren't saying that schools should run these clubs. We're saying local authorities should run them. We think that student teachers coming out of university, some of those would like the opportunity to work in such schemes. We're not saying that teachers should be doing it, that have got a long overdue holiday coming up. We are wanting to shape what this proposal is, and we think children deserve that sort of play scheme offer during the holidays. 4 and 5 are 2 linked points. In point 4, we say that public buildings, this is possibly the most controversial thing that we're saying. Public buildings such as libraries, sports halls, civic centres, religious buildings could be used to expand the space available to schools so that social distancing can be achieved. Because if we're in a situation in September where the virus level is lower, but where scientists are still saying you can't have 30 children in a class because of social distancing, and that's where we'll expect to be. We don't think that the scientists will let up on at least a 1 meter social distancing, and we don't think you can get 30 kids in a class with a 1 meter social distance. So there needs to be more spaces available. And then in point 5, there need to be more people to teach them. So mobilizing all of the existing teachers, all of the supply teachers, but then reaching out further. And as we see it, that's the only way of children being able to be back in school, unless they're going to be on a shift system. of sometimes children being in, sometimes children being out. It's a big thing we're putting forward here, but we want to be seen to be putting forward the solution for our society. We want to be seen as the people who say, yeah, if it works, then we can get parents back to work, but government has to put in. Our class sizes are too big in this country. You can't run the classes the size they are. So you have to look bigger and wider. It's government that would have to do that, but we're putting this plan up to test government to say, will you do that? Or are they instead just going to try and force 30 kids into a class when it's unsafe?
And indeed, when, talking to the Danish Teachers Union, and they successfully got all the children back to school, but they requisitioned public buildings. That's what they did. They got teachers who'd left the profession back into the profession to teach smaller classes now. So we know that that is a model that can work, and it's something that needs to be explored because we have to think outside the box. Point number 6 is we cannot carry on with assessments in the same way in the past. So the primary school Key Stage 2 SATs need just to be abandoned next year. The children taking them coming up from year 5 have had less time in school. Also, we shouldn't be doing baseline. We shouldn't be doing baseline. We shouldn't be doing the phonics test. We should be focusing on creative learning and children's well-being. And we should be using teacher assessment and supporting teachers in assessing pupils so that their parents have got a good idea about where they are in their learning and what do they need to do to develop. Plans must be made for blended learning. You could call this part-time learning, because even with more buildings, it is likely that children will be spending less time in school. They will be spending some time at home, some time in school. Perhaps it can be that a priority is for disadvantaged and vulnerable children to be in school the most, because that's the safest place for them. But that means that other children may be spending some time at home, some time in school. So we need to think about how we support children's learning at home and how we support teachers doing blended learning, and in a way which doesn't just increase their workload exponentially. So we need to really start thinking about that, as they are doing in Scotland and Wales. The Scottish and Welsh governments are really thinking about that. Our government isn't doing that. Children and young people in disadvantaged households need access to the internet. 700,000 children and young people don't have access to the internet at home. They need that. The government's laptop scheme is inadequate, completely inadequate. They need devices to learn on, particularly those of them who don't have any of those devices at home. But also they need creative activities. They need books. Amazon is a multi-billion-pound company. Why isn't the government doing a partnership to get books, reading books, into the homes of disadvantaged children and young people? Getting pens there, getting paints there, getting activities for them to do. We need that. We know that childhood poverty and inequality are huge influences on education attainment. We know that 40% of the educational attainment gap, which the politicians are so worried about, is set in stone before children even start school. So poverty, poor housing, poorer food, the stress and strains of bringing up children in poverty impact so badly on their ability to develop and grow. Before they're even 5, 40% of that attainment gap is set in stone. And then schools are charged just to make that up without any support or help. So we have to start letting, with 9 children in every class of 30 are poor. So we have to have fewer poor children. And to do that, we have to reform the benefit system. We have to ensure that their work is well paid and that parents and carers are able to work for good wages so that fewer children are actually born in poverty, which is so devastating to their lives. And there should be a national plan for children's well-being. When we asked our members, what's the key thing you want to do when children return, they say we want them to focus on well-being. We want them to reintegrate into school really well. So we would like you to promote this plan in the next few weeks. Do look out for it on our website, in the press, and tell us what you think about it. Do continue to insist on the safest reopening of schools, taking into account a rise in the R rate if there is a rise. Where schools have reopened more widely, do continue to insist that they do so safely. Keep going back to the checklist. The checklist was something that was done before schools opened more widely. Keep going back to it, keep checking it, and keep insisting that it is that the opening is done well. Ensure that children in smaller groups to allow social distancing or social cohort distancing to take place, and follow the escalation guidance. The guidance comes with escalation if it's not happening, what you need to do, if you're a rep, what you need to do, if you're a member in school, what you need to do to ensure that if there are concerns about health and safety, those concerns are escalated properly.
And I want to introduce a new topic. There is, in this term, we want to start talking about pay as well as safety, because there's the question of pay progression to come up. And we think that most heads are going to do the right thing on this, but we are starting to hear of some heads saying, well, you haven't met your targets, etc. And we think it's important that we start talking about this. No one should be turned down for pay progression because of the lockdown or because of the consequences of the lockdown. And most people will have found their objectives have turned out to be objectives that can't be met because of the lockdown. Now, even the government is saying that schools must ensure that teachers are not penalised about pay progression as a result of partial school closures, where this has impacted on the ability of the teacher to fully meet their objectives. Our position from the NEU is that everyone this year should get pay progression unless they've already been placed on formal competency procedures. There is going to be no way to fairly distinguish between people in terms of pay progression on the objectives because of the partial school closure situation. So our opinion is that everyone should get it unless they're already in a competency procedure. We think NAHT and the National Governors Association are close to that position. It's the position that we think you should be adopting in your school, and we're going to be getting materials out along that. So we do think it's important to start talking about that now. And then going back to the questions of safety. We keep talking about safety of communities, and that means trying to slow school opening, and also the safety of individuals and about vulnerable people. And I've done this several times. I'm just going to say it again. Extremely clinically vulnerable and people who live with them, they should be at home. Clinically vulnerable people and people who live with them, they should be at home. On NEU surveys, that's about 23% of the profession as a whole. It might be slightly more or slightly less in your school, but that's manageable for all those people currently to be at home, because there are more children than that at home. And we think we can go further. 60-year-olds are more at risk. The risk goes up dramatically with age. So we think in lots of cases there are good arguments for 60-year-olds to be at home, especially if they're worried, especially if they have asthma. And the same thing applies in lots of ways to Black people who are a bit younger than that as well. Black people are at more risk. And on some figures that we've seen, we're working on these, but a 55-year-old Black person might be at the same risk. A 55-year-old Bengali person might be at the same risk as a 60-year-old white person. So we want you to talk about that. We want heads to talk about it and to look at who is most vulnerable, and for those people to be at home. Now, that's not necessarily forever, because there's a combination of risks. There's the risk of catching the disease and then the risk of being very ill from it. As the virus level falls, if the government stays in control of it, then it gets less and less risky over time. But this term, when all those children are still at home, then there's no reason why those people who are most vulnerable shouldn't be at home. We've got all that sorts of those letters on our website. We know that people are using those letters and getting success. We get success stories reported to us about that regularly. So do keep going back to that issue. Some heads we hear sometimes they say, oh, it's not the fair way to treat everyone. Everyone has to come in. That's not fairness. If some people are more at risk, it's not fair to say that all of them come in. It will be fair to say the people who are more at risk, we want them to do more of the work from home, but we have to balance up the risks that people face. So do carry on talking with your head teacher and with your other members about that issue. Go to your branch secretary, talk about it with your rep, and then if you can't find a solution, then go up to your branch secretary and talk about it there as well.
Yesterday, we had a huge call on racism with the Reverend Diane Abbott and, sorry, I've got a blank. Kevin, who else wrote that?
Reverend Jackson.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, thank you. 6,500 members on the call about Black Lives Matter. And we're going to do more work on the education area, and do look out for this in the coming weeks. We know that black staff feel particularly vulnerable because they are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And we also know that black staff are more likely to work in areas in schools which serve deprived communities. So the NEU has always said we want this unequal level of risk for black staff to be taken into consideration. That's black teachers and black TAs and black leaders as well. So we're engaging with the Department for Education about the evidence on racial disparities and COVID-19. We have a document about that on our website for you to download about the evidence on racial disparities and COVID-19. And we are saying that black staff with an underlying health condition who are being pressured to go into work should contact their rep or the advice line to get support. We've got new guidance on the website, both for vulnerable workers, vulnerable members, and for black members. And it's really excellent guidance. It's been developed, giving you what your legal rights are, giving you what the different categories of vulnerability are, and giving you advice about how to write letters, about how to contact your doctor, and about how to represent yourself or to get help in representing yourself to your school leadership. So do go on our website and do look at that guidance that came out last week. It's really excellent.
Thank you.
I'm just ending by saying thank you for everything that you're doing as reps, as members in your school, and for the union in its political position. Without you, there would have been a much more unsafe return to schools, unsafe for individuals, for parents, for grandparents, and for society. You've achieved a huge amount, and together we can confidently go forward, keeping schools safer than they would be, educating children, and building our union to do more in the future.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I just wanted to make a comment. As someone who's worked in holiday hunger clubs, I want to let you all know that Marcus Rashford's aunt used to be a Manchester NEU rep, so you may like to know that as well. So absolutely linked within the union. So that's a really great thing. There's been a number of questions come through, and one of them was around, are the union working with the government on these plans? We have written time and time again, and we have offered ourselves to be working with the government at Mary and Kevin level, at staff level, at every level possible. And we continue to do that and continue to push to say, please talk to us, please work with us. And we have sent them our 10-point plan. So absolutely, we've done that. There are a number of questions coming in around, firstly, my question is, this is from Tessoir. My question is, what are the plans for September, as it's not going to be the same after the pandemic? So you covered some of that, but you might want to put some more detail in. We've got 2 on bubbles, but I know more are coming in on bubbles. Faye has asked, are teaching assistants expected to go into school for essential jobs if they are not assigned to a bubble or working with children? And Daniel has asked, should existing bubbles be mixed with new bubbles? There have been several bubble related questions. So they're just a few bubble questions. But there is another one I want to just finish on, which is, can we have clarification around if schools are to be opened over the summer? I think Mary and Kevin touched on that. And I think it's really important to note that your contract, if it's just for term time, you should not be expected to be working. So even if you're a support staff member, if you're a teacher, you should not be expected to work. It should be something that's coordinated by the local authority. We may have teachers that want to work. I know in my local authority, they put on holiday clubs and teachers volunteer to work and get paid for doing that. But that has to be a choice. It cannot be that it's part of your contract and working. So I hope that clears that up. But I'll come on to you two for bubbles and for September plans.
Well, with the bubble question, can you be mixing bubbles? That just negates the whole point of bubbles. The whole point of bubbles was that the children would be together and they would be taught in that bubble, and that meant that there was less opportunities for transmission across different bubbles. So if schools are mixing bubbles, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It negates the whole point. I mean, if you're mixing bubbles, you might as well just have classes, because you're not keeping children separately in an enclosed bubble in order to try and keep any possibility of the transmission of the virus down. So I can't see why that would be happening. I think that is not what the government said. I think go back to our checklist and look at what we said about social distancing and social cohort distancing, and go to the head and say, no, this is not, because remember our checklist was based on government guidance. It's based on DfE guidance. So you've got the authority to go back to your head and say, well, this is what the DfE said. The NEU checklist is based on that. We shouldn't be mixing bubbles. It makes a nonsense of having bubbles in the first place.
I do think the fact that there are so many questions about this points up that the government's guidance is not clear enough, is not robust enough. The fact that it's been 42 different, it's not the same guidance has been reissued 42 times, but since that announcement by the Prime Minister, 42 different bits, and there's more now. I know that head teachers were enraged on yesterday when there was another announcement that messed up all their planning. And the notion of a bubble, if it's in early years, if you're saying you know that children can't socially distance, and so the way you're trying to cope with it is having a small group of children where the virus might spread in that small group, but it won't spread to other groups, then you certainly can't mix those bubbles. There is supposed to be social distancing. If you haven't got social distancing, then we've got a real problem. Bubbles are sort of an alternative to social distancing, but we need to have social distancing, and that does go against the idea of bubbles mixing. I think that we should press the government for clearer and further advice on this, though, because it's causing so many questions here. I think the government has to be put to the test of producing clearer guidance on it, and then we can critique the government's guidance.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem about bubbles was that they realised that even with 15 in the bubble, that was too many children for social distancing at 2 meters. It would be too many children for social distancing at 1 meter. So it was always a compromise. Denmark, when they looked at bubbles for early years, it was bubbles of 3 in the classroom and 5 outside the classroom. So when the government says we mirror Denmark, no, they didn't. So the reason why bubbles has got so confused is because it was always a confusing concept to begin with anyhow. But we will go back, as Kevin said, and ask for more guidance. And Tatwa's question, what are the plans for September, and is it going to be the same after the pandemic? I think we've covered a bit of that. But one of the things which is also very clear is we need to know now what the government's thinking for September is. Because we can't just wait for September and then the government tells us what their plans are for September. We need to know that now. And that's another issue that we're really raising with the government. And Sue's asked, can we have clarification around if schools are to be opened over the summer holidays for catch-up? So Sue, our position is this. Gavin Williamson has said that no teacher will be made to work over the summer, that teachers need their summer break. He made that in the House of Commons, that statement, and we will keep him to it. Schools may be open in the summer, but if they are open for summer holiday clubs, they should be run by the local authority. So it should not be a requirement on school leaders or teachers to work in those summer holiday clubs unless they want to. We think there's enough work for teachers who are supply teachers who may want to get involved, as Kevin said, for student teachers who are leaving college and who might want to work, for youth workers, for others. So, but Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, has been absolutely clear. He made that announcement in the House of Commons that teachers would not be required to work over the summer holiday. They needed their holiday, and we will keep. I mean, he's made that statement, and he's got to keep to that. So if you're told you've got to come in, we're running a summer holiday club, you don't have to. There's no contractual requirement on you to do that, and you do not have to come in over your summer holidays.
We've also had our legal people look at the Coronavirus Act, and we don't believe it gives the government the power to change terms and conditions in that sort of way. So we're saying no to compulsory working in the summer. It's worth saying there is so much confusion. I'm looking at the questions that are coming up in the chat, and then we've been given some specific ones to answer. But Boris Johnson makes an announcement saying there's going to be some big summer catch-up scheme. And as far as we can understand it, not even Gavin Williamson knew what Boris was saying. And we don't know what he meant by that. And we still have no idea what that is. It won't be, but it can't be schools being open across the summer. It can't be that.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that. And the word catch-up is something that the NEU doesn't have in its 10-point plan. We talk about recovery, and we talk about you know, as educators, support staff, teaching assistants, teachers, we know where our kids are and we know where they need to be. And so it's not about catch up. So I think that's really important as well. We've got some more questions coming in for you too. So Stephen has asked, my school have been offered the use of a community room off site and school is considering, but I've just been made aware that the DfE gave guidance yesterday saying that it shouldn't be considered this term. Is this true? And then Rahana has asked, what does the NEU say about teachers attending work who are living with extremely critical, vulnerable people? School offered to come in to teach or come to do an admin job. And then Lucy has asked, what does the NEU think about members of staff who are at great risk or prefer to come to school? How much should this be a matter of choice? So if you're at a great risk, should you be able to choose to come to school? I can tell you what my local authority have done about that today. What support does the NEU give us who are expecting to start NQT years in September but have no job secured, as the school that trained us have not offered a job as no teachers are moving? So we've got those four.
So on the community room, like Mary said, we know that in Denmark, that's what the government has organised. We've put it in our 10-point plan, because it's what we think the government needs to do here if it wants children back. But the government so far has said not to do it. So to Stephen, we think your school shouldn't do it. You shouldn't go outside the government guidance and going further than them in that sort of way. So I think it's a good point for us that schools are starting to look for that space, but the government is blocking schools looking for that space at the moment. On these questions of clinically vulnerable, so we are really clear. So this is to Rehana. She asks, what does the NEU say about teachers attending school who are living with extremely clinically vulnerable people? So extremely clinically vulnerable, those are people like recovering from cancer. If they contract the virus, the risk of them dying is really elevated. So to protect them, to protect the NHS, we think that people who live with them should be making their contribution from home. That's where we think they should be doing the work. So we don't think they should be going into schools to teach. That's not the position that we think they should be working from home.
And shall I do the people, students who are just qualifying and doing their NQT year? Really, my heart goes out to you because I know it's really tough. It really is tough. Teachers aren't moving, and it's really very difficult. It's difficult to get an interview. It's difficult to apply. You can't go and visit the school. It's really, really difficult. We are going to be running a call for students who are leaving their course, and we're thinking about further advice and help. We can't wish the situation away. We wish we could. I suspect, however, that things will change quite quickly. If the government adopts our plan, then we need all the newly qualified teachers in the profession, because we will need far many more teachers in order to teach smaller classes. And and we think this is an investment the government absolutely should make. I mean, I know that you have to pay for your course, but actually training teachers is incredibly expensive as well. So it was much better if those trained teachers can get into the profession, can start working, can start building up their skills and their experience. And that's what we're advocating for as well. That's why we have included in the plan this increase in teachers, including newly qualified teachers, in order to teach smaller classes of pupils in order that they get the work that they need and start to develop their career. But we do understand it is really difficult. We do understand that, and we're looking out for you.
And we are organising a Zoom, like Mary said, for newly qualified teachers in the coming weeks. And like Mary said, we are calling for a huge expansion of the number of teachers and TAs to work in these expanded settings that we think are going to be necessary.
Thank you very much. And one of the points I know Kevin touched, didn't touch on, but went into detail around the vulnerable. And it's just around that we will have members that are in those categories, but want to go into school. And that's really difficult, because actually the school needs to have a policy around that. And I'm just today, my own local authority had a discussion to say a risk assessment absolutely has to be done on that member of staff and if needs be, an occupational health review, only because they want to make sure it's correct for that person. And then it's very difficult if you're in the government's listing of critically vulnerable. So I suggest those people have a conversation with their leadership and with their reps in school, and look at what's going on through their academy or their local authority. Got some more questions coming for you. Natasha, what is the NEU stand on marking online learning when we are back in school in our bubbles and working with pupils? Irene, my school is open to year 2, 3, 4 and 5 soon. When I asked if this is not against government guidelines, they said it is according to each school's discretion. We are already stretched. What is your view on that? Victoria, surely this is time for the whole curriculum to be revised. Matt, are we willing to accept as many children as possible in schools from this point on? My school is only open to year 6 at the moment in bubbles of 10, but I feel my head teacher is keen to open more widely. And in the light of Boris Johnson's today urging parents to send their children back to school if at all possible, we are heading for some potential unsafe situations.
So,
Can I take that? Oh, God, no.
Yeah. No, you go.
First, Mary.
No, you go first, Kelly.
Okay, Matt's question about, are we now up for as many children as possible? That's not our position. We're not convinced that it's safe to have as many children back as possible. The Prime Minister says things, and it's sometimes hard to quite follow what he said, but I looked at the broadcast and he said parents in the eligible groups, parents with children are eligible. I think that he was talking about nursery, reception, year 1 and year 6, year 10 and year 12. So it's not about every child. That would be crazy. They just abandoned that, and we don't agree with it. So I think it's important to go to your head and say, look, it's not time to do that. These things have to be planned carefully and properly, and the government has not made a plan for other year groups to come back. They've now started softening the edge, but that edge is, if you've got a gap because not all of your year 6 has come back, then taking a few more children back to fill up the gap. That's what they're talking about, not opening all the year groups and getting children back. That is unsafe, and it's outside what the government guidance is as far as we understand it. So it's wrong both in government terms and in our terms.
So if I could just add to that from Kevin what said, I've got the guidance in front of me. Primary schools should only welcome back additional children where they have already made provision available for the children of critical workers, vulnerable children, and children in nursery reception year 1 and year 6, and as many as possible attend. They can accommodate more children while still following approaches set out in the protective measures guidance and their own risk assessment. So they cannot take back more pupils if you can't have social distancing in place and all the other protective measures that have been in the guidance. That protective guidance is not dismissed because it's just a few weeks old. So what the government is talking about there is really what they have in mind is schools where they're open for reception year 1 and year 6, but very, very few children have come back. And in that scenario, they're saying that schools have the opportunity to get back perhaps more vulnerable children, perhaps more children of key workers, perhaps more disadvantaged children. But it is not carte blanche for bringing in wholesale extra years. And if they are going to do that, you really need to get in touch with your rep, you really need to get in touch with your branch, because then the key question would have to be, how can you do that safely? So that is not the government's intention. You know, somebody said, Irene said, my school is opening to years 2, 3, 4 and 5 soon. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be, because the same social distancing, safety measures have to happen, have to occur. So they shouldn't be. Victoria said, surely it's time for the whole curriculum to be revised. Absolutely it is. It is absolutely time for the whole curriculum to be revised. And this is an opportunity to think about and curriculum with values about caring for children, values about children as good citizens, values about creativity, blended learning around children becoming more independent learners. It's time to move away from a curriculum which crams. You know, we're 3rd in the world for rote learning in our schools because we cram the curriculum full of facts. And it's time, and that's not the sort of curriculum which we need for the 21st century. So we absolutely do agree that it is time for the curriculum to be revised.
Thank you. Okay, I've got some more questions. So somebody, GJ, has asked, talking about pay, is the pay rise for NQTs to 26,000 going to be implemented now? Tony, what if you are a single parent of BAME children? Should they be able to work from home? Are BAME children vulnerable or BAME vulnerable? Kieran, is the NEU pushing for regular COVID testing in schools as wider opening occurs? And Christina, will teachers be recommended to wear face shields? If not, why not? Could they potentially be used to help a return? And finally, Nikki, does the legislation that compelled us to work in the Easter holidays not make us vulnerable to lose the summer holidays?
So there was no legislation which compelled working in the Easter holidays. We hope, and we understand this was the case in most places, that people got 2 weeks off, either before or after Easter, and we encouraged that. We said we thought it was good for schools to volunteer, for teachers to volunteer, to keep the schools running over Easter on the restricted basis for key workers. But we always said, because there are so few teachers were needed for the rotas, that it should have been possible to have a clear 2 weeks, either before or after. There's no legislation that forced it, and that legislation does not apply. So there's no legislation that would apply during the summer as far as that goes.
If you're a single parent of BAME children, should they be able to work from home? There's no evidence that BAME children are significantly more at risk than white children. The key determinant in risk is age. So if you are, as Kevin said before, if you are older and a black member with other existing comorbidities, then that is the risk factor. There isn't a greater risk factor for BAME children. I think one of the problems and one of the worries that black families have in the black community is children taking, if they're living in a multi-generational household, a child carrying the virus back to grandparents, because what the government doesn't know is the fact children don't tend, overwhelmingly, children are either asymptomatic or don't get the virus badly, overwhelmingly. And that's across different communities and different ethnic groups. The issue that many black families have is if they live in a multi-generational household, they worry about the child taking the virus back to older relatives. That's a different question than the one Tony has asked. And Kieran, is the NEU pushing for regular COVID testing in schools as wider openings occur? Well, absolutely, the NEU is pushing for contact, test and trace. And we're in our 5-point our test for opening schools, we said if there is an outbreak in a school, the government had to have a plan for school isolation and closing down that school so the outbreak didn't continue. And that is actually one of the tests the government has met. But we're absolutely pushing for much better testing and contact tracing. Christina, will teachers be recommended to wear face shields? Could they be used to help a return? Absolutely. We think that if you want to wear a face mask in school, you absolutely should be given the right to do so. We're hearing of some schools where leaders are saying you can't wear a face mask. If that's what you want to do, to feel safer and to feel more secure, we know that face masks largely stop you spreading the virus to other people, but if you want to do that in school, then you should be allowed to do so, to feel safer.
Thank you very much. And I've got some more questions coming in. Hayley, what are your thoughts around live lessons where teachers, so firstly, live lessons, and Hayley, not the only person to ask that. So I'll say firstly, what are thoughts around live lessons? And then Hayley has an added concern where teachers are dyslexic, it would cause a great deal of stress. So that's that one. And then Toby, would the NEU support a plan to extend this academic year until the end of December to give children a chance to cover more of the curriculum and then move up to the next year after a break in January?
We've looked at
lessons.
Toby's point about the extension of the school year. People have looked at that. People have come up with it as a potential solution. And you know, we just don't know when this crisis will be over. There is no way you can guarantee that we'll all be back in school from January without a second peak occurring. So we don't think that that sort of planning is sensible planning. We think we have to start the new school year. The children have to begin to be in the next year group. We have to instead look at the curriculum and the assessment so that it's a doable thing. We shouldn't have the SATs next May for the children who are year 5 now. The SATs are only there to assess the school anyway, and you can't fairly assess the school. So we don't support the idea of changing the year group, the end of the school year. We think we have to move on because we can't predict where the virus will be. We have to change what we're doing in the school year instead.
Thank you. And Mary, can I come to you for live lessons before Mary has to
Yes.
disappear after this to another Zoom
Yes.
call?
And just to back up what Kevin's saying about extending the academic year, that would be really difficult for children in year 7, children starting nursery. I mean, the way we organise our education system is we just have to keep going. So what we need to do is refocus our curriculum and our qualifications to take account of the new situation which is affecting us. The question about live lessons and dyslexia asked by I'm trying to find out who
Hayley.
it is.
Hayley.
If you're dyslexic, you should have a reasonable adjustment because you've got a special need. You know, you've got a special need. You have a reasonable adjustment. And doing live lessons, if that puts that stress on you because you're afraid of being humiliated, because the pressure of live lessons means you can't prepare online lessons and you can't prepare what you need to do and ensure that your writing is checked and your spelling is checked and your grammar is checked, then that should not be the case. You should not be put under that pressure because it's just not appropriate. It is not appropriate for you to be put under that pressure. And again, if that's what's being required, you need to be able to be either going yourself or be supported to go in and explain that to your school leader and explain the extra support that you need in order to have the proper teaching relationship you need with your pupils. You have many talents and many things to give, and the dyslexia will need support, not being put in a position where you feel stressed and unsupported and humiliated.
Thank you. And thank you, Mary, for your time. I know you need to go to your next Zoom meeting. And so these last 2 questions are coming to Kevin. So Zara, thanks, Mary. So Zara has asked, what will happen as we start to return to normal a little and our partners, etc., go back to work and our children's school don't have space to take our child? And then Lisa in Nottingham, what should or can we do when a child has been sent home with symptoms and the parent refuses to have their child tested?
So Zara's question points up the difficulties of the period we're entering into.
Yeah.
Teachers are going to become more and more seen as key workers because they let other people go back to work. And so I think Zara's children eventually will be treated as the children of key workers. And so that will be the solution to it. But this is going to take working through. Lisa's question, what can we do when a child has been sent home with symptoms and the parent refuses to have their child tested? So just think that through, that the child has got symptoms, so the child might have COVID-19. Children transmit it. They then transmit it to other parents. You have to assume that the case is COVID-19 unless the child is tested and proved not to have it. So you have to assume that child has COVID-19, especially if they're not going to be tested. And if a child has COVID-19, then you have to, at the minimum, close that class, and all those children need to be at home, some testing done amongst them to see if it's spread. But at the minimum, that class has to close. And we have to employ the precautionary principle in that case.
Thank you, Kevin. And I want to say thank you very much to everybody that's been on the call this evening. I think that, today's decision around free school meals was one of our 10 points. And it shows that when people come together and work together and have genuinely the care of the most vulnerable and the pupils that we teach in their sites, things can change. And I think that the NEU has always had our most vulnerable children in our sites when we are thinking about all of the work that we have done. And I've said on other calls before that we have done many stuff that seems reactive And the 10-point plan isn't reactive. It's around strategy. It's around planning. It's what the Denmark government have done, the Danish government have done with the Denmark Teachers Trade Union. It's what Scotland have done. It's what Wales are doing with regards to working with their unions, the teacher unions and the support staff and the profession, to know that when we are returning at whatever point it's safer to open wider, there is a strategy and a plan in place. So I guess for you, what we'd like you to be doing is, there's a couple of things. The bubble questions come up time and time again today. To us, the bubble should be as part of your risk assessment. Who's working in those bubbles, who's involved in those bubbles, what pupils are in those bubbles should be part of a risk assessment. And that means actually, because we sometimes teach challenging children and work with challenging children, those children should be part of that risk assessment as well and part of those bubbles. So when we're looking at keeping our risk assessments really, really under review. I've said it before, when we do a school trip, we keep those risk assessments under review. We make sure everyone is aware of any changes or anything that comes through. So please keep an eye on that, and please keep talking with staff around and see, is the reality of what the risk assessment says happening in your school building. If it isn't, then you need to raise those concerns and say, look, this is what the risk assessment says, but actually this is happening because we need more equipment, or we need more things, or we've got more pupils. So we need to really make sure that we're keeping those risk assessments, and that's about talking to each other and talking to leaders. And it's not to be a pain, it's not to be divisive, it's to make sure that we are all safe and that we can continue to keep our schools and open our schools more widely as it gets safer and safer to do so. Because the worst thing would be to have an outbreak and a shutdown, not just for the education of those pupils, but for like the mental health and well-being of those pupils and that school community. So there's that. The other thing is our 10-point plan. We're really proud of our 10-point plan. We have talked with members. We've listened, like I said, at the beginning of this, we record all of these calls and we keep everything in mind when we're putting our strategies together. And that 10-point plan came about the fact that we care about vulnerable pupils, but we also care about education going forwards. So whether that's working with Ofqual to make sure that when these year 10s and 12s are returning, they know what they're returning to. What are they going to be learning? What are they going to be doing? So please have a look at that. See how that will impact in your school, and get your reps and your leaders to have those conversations with your local authority or with your academies. This is about changing education, we hope for the better, but also making it safer to be in schools as we go forward, and finding a way to educate more and more pupils during this really unprecedented time. We don't know if there's a second spike. We don't know if the government will reduce the 1 metre distancing, and we don't know the impact on that. One of the things we do know is this government doesn't do science experiments like you should do, where you put one change of variable in and then you see the impact. They put lots of changes of variables in. So we need to keep a very, very careful eye on what that looks like in our community. And if you are in the southeast like me, that might be different to if you are in London or if you're in the northeast. So we need to be aware of that as well. Keep talking, keep asking questions. If you need some help, there's the advice line, but there's also the number on the back of your membership card. But more importantly, there's your colleagues that you work with. I'm going to just hand back to Kevin to say a thank you and a last few words, and then we'll end the call.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. That was brilliant. And just to say again, thank you for being on the call. We'll look at all the questions. We'll make sure that FAQs are updated to answer all of these questions over time, and we'll do more of these calls. We can see fantastic comments in here. The union is all of us together, and the work you're doing in your schools and your colleges is fantastic work. And we're building the union, and we're educating our children. We're keeping our society safe. Thank you for everything you're doing.
And thank you very much for your time this evening. Somebody has posted the NEU YouTube link where you can catch a lot of our Zoom meetings that have been on there, whether that's last night's one, I'm not sure if that's up there yet, but absolutely some of the previous ones and the conversations we've had. We've had our secondary schools, we've had a whole range of Zoom meetings, so please go in and have a look at those as well. And thanks again for your time. Good evening.